My name is Alexia, and at 68 years old, I never imagined life would take this turn. My husband Frank and I built our Montana ranch from nothing during our 45-year marriage before cancer took him 2 weeks ago. Our son Jackson disappeared from our lives 5 years earlier after slapping me across the face during a heated argument. Then, like a ghost returning to haunt us, he showed up at Frank's funeral in an expensive suit demanding half our ranch. I just smiled quietly when he made his claim because I knew what was coming. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear how my entitled son learned the hard lesson about family loyalty and the true meaning of inheritance. I was born in a tiny town in Montana where everyone knew your business before you did. Growing up, I always dreamed of having a big, loving family on a piece of land we could call our own. That dream started becoming reality when I met Frank at the county fair back in 1977. I was 21 working at the local diner and wondering if life had anything more to offer than endless coffee refills and pie slices. Frank caught my eye at the livestock exhibition. He stood tall and confident next to his prize bull, his smile brighter than the summer sun when our gazes met. He asked me out right there, and within 6 months we were inseparable. Frank had big dreams about ranching, just like I had big dreams about family. We married in a simple ceremony at my parents' farm, surrounded by wildflowers and promises. We started our ranch with barely anything but determination. Our first purchase was 80 acres of what most people would call undesirable land, too rocky and uneven for easy farming. But Frank saw potential where others saw problems. We lived in a tiny trailer at first, saving every penny while working multiple jobs. I clerked at the general store while Frank worked construction during the day and tended our growing herd of cattle in the evenings. Those early years were tough but beautiful. Every fence post we put in the ground, every stable wall we raised with our own hands felt like building our future brick by brick. We added cabins and expanded our property boundary whenever we could afford it. The sounds of hammering and the smell of fresh-cut wood became the backdrop of our life together. For years, we tried to have a child. Pregnancy after pregnancy ended in heartbreak until we almost gave up hope. Then, when I was 34, our miracle happened. Jackson came into the world after a difficult 20-hour labor, screaming with such force that Frank joked he would be ordering the ranch hands around before he could walk. Jackson was the most beautiful baby I had ever seen. His tiny fingers and wise eyes seemed to take in everything. As he grew, he became our little shadow on the ranch, curious about every animal and piece of equipment. By 3, he insisted on helping me feed the chickens every morning, his little rubber boots leaving imprints next to mine in the mud. Frank was the kind of father who believed in teaching by doing. He hoisted Jackson onto his first pony when he was just 5 years old, his small hands gripping the reins while Frank walked alongside giving instructions. By 8, Jackson was helping with the cattle, learning to read their behavior and movements. Frank would beam with pride, watching him saying, "That boy has ranching in his blood, Alexia." Our family life revolved around simple but meaningful traditions. Sunday dinners were sacred, the 3 of us sitting down to a meal no matter how busy the ranch became. Every summer we would camp for a weekend by the creek that ran through our property, cooking over an open fire and telling stories under the stars. Christmas meant handmade decorations and gifts that meant something, not just store-bought trinkets. Jackson showed a special talent with horses that even impressed our most experienced ranch hands. By the time he was 12, he could calm the most skittish colt with just his presence. Everyone said he had a gift that he could read an animal better than most grown men. I homeschooled him until high school, making sure he had both book learning and practical skills. The teenage years brought changes, as they always do. Jackson entered public high school and quickly became popular. His upbringing had given him confidence and capability that other kids noticed. He joined the rodeo team and brought home trophies that Frank displayed prominently in our living room. Frank was tough but fair as a father. He expected honesty and hard work, but he was also quick with praise when it was deserved. "A man earns his place in this world," he would tell Jackson. "Nothing worth having comes easy." The first subtle signs of trouble came during Jackson's sophomore year. He started comparing our ranch to the homes of wealthier classmates whose parents worked corporate jobs in the city. "Tyler has a pool and a game room, Dad," he would say, or "Amanda's family goes to Hawaii every spring break." Frank would just shake his head. "We have 200 acres of God's country and animals that depend on us. You can swim in the creek and ride horses whenever you want. Some things money cannot buy. We made sacrifices to save for Jackson's college education. Frank took on additional cattle contracts, working from dawn until well past dusk. I started selling homemade jams and quilts at the farmer's market to add to the college fund. We wanted to give him opportunities we never had a chance to learn modern agricultural techniques that could help take our ranch to the next level. The day Jackson left for State University to study agricultural management was one of the proudest of our lives. He stood tall next to his packed truck, looking so much like Frank that it brought tears to my eyes. We had such hopes that he would return with knowledge to help our ranch thrive for another generation. By then, our ranch had flourished beyond our early dreams. We had expanded to over 500 acres with a herd of 120 cattle, 20 horses, and various other livestock. The original tiny cabin had been replaced by a sturdy ranch house built with lumber from our own land. We had even started to make plans for a small retirement cabin where Frank and I could live once Jackson took over the main operations. Those dreams seemed so certain then. The ranch was prospering after decades of hard work, and our son was heading off to get the education that would help him carry our legacy forward. If only I had known how quickly dreams can shift like Montana sand in a strong wind. The first semester calls should have been warning signs. Jackson was more interested in telling us about parties and social events than his classes. When I asked about his agricultural studies, his answers were vague and quickly redirected. Frank would hang up the phone with a furrowed brow, saying, "Boy needs to focus. College isn't cheap." When Jackson returned for winter break, I hardly recognized him. Gone were the flannel shirts and worn jeans, replaced by designer clothes that must have cost a fortune. His hair was styled differently, and he carried himself with an air of someone who had outgrown his surroundings. Still, I was just happy to have my son home and prepared all his favorite meals. The real shock came when he introduced us to his girlfriend Tara, who arrived 2 days later in a car that cost more than we made in a year. She was from a wealthy Chicago family studying business at the same university. Pretty in a polished way, with perfect nails that had clearly never dug into garden soil or handled livestock. Tara barely concealed her contempt for our lifestyle. She would wrinkle her nose at the smell of the stables and make comments like, "This is so authentic," in a tone that made it clear she meant primitive. When I served dinner on our handmade wooden table, she asked if we had any real furniture in the house. Jackson seemed blind to her insults, or worse, found them amusing. He began complaining about aspects of ranch life he had never questioned before. The internet was too slow, the house was too drafty, the town was too small, and had nothing to do. This from a boy who had never been bored a day in his life on the ranch. Frank tried to engage Jackson in ranch work during the break, but his lessons about the importance of consistency and care for the animals fell on deaf ears. "Dad, there are easier ways to make money now," Jackson said dismissively after Frank explained the breeding program he had carefully developed over decades. The argument about the vehicle really opened our eyes to how much Jackson had changed. His old truck, which had served him faithfully through high school, was suddenly embarrassing. He wanted us to buy him a new sports car instead, something more appropriate for a college student. Appropriate for what Frank had asked, genuinely confused, for hauling feed, for pulling a trailer, for any actual work. For fitting in, Jackson had replied as if that explained everything. The money discussions became increasingly tense. Jackson seemed to have developed expensive tastes overnight, from clothing to electronics to dining out. One evening while he was showering, I found a credit card statement in his jacket pocket. My heart sank seeing the balance over $6,000 on a card I never knew he had. That night, I gently tried to discuss financial responsibility with him. "College is about learning, honey, not spending money you don't have," I said as carefully as I could. His response cut deeply. "You wouldn't understand modern life, Mom. Things are different now than in your day." He said it with such dismissive confidence, as if my decades of carefully managing our ranch finances counted for nothing compared to his semester and a half of college. The remainder of that winter break was tense. Frank retreated to the barn more often, avoiding confrontations that seemed to be brewing constantly. I tried to bridge the gap between father and son, but it felt like trying to connect two people standing on opposite shores of an ever-widening river. When Jackson returned to school, his calls home became increasingly rare. When he did call, it was usually because he needed something, typically money, for unexpected expenses. We learned through the university newsletter, rather than from our son, that he had switched his major from agricultural management to business administration. Frank took this news hard. "What business does he think he's going to run, if not this ranch?" he asked me one night, staring into the fireplace. "Everything we've built was meant for him to continue." I tried to understand Jackson's perspective. "Maybe he's just exploring options, Frank. College is a time for trying new paths." "Some paths lead away from home for good," Frank replied, and the sadness in his voice broke my heart. I became the mediator between them, trying to help Frank see that times were changing while encouraging Jackson not to abandon his roots entirely. It was an exhausting emotional tightrope to walk. The final disappointment of that year came during spring break. Jackson had promised to come home, saying he missed the ranch and wanted to help with the early calving season. 3 days before his expected arrival, I was checking email when a notification from a social media site caught my attention. There was Jackson tagged in photos from a beach in Cancun, with Tara and friends clearly having planned this trip instead of coming home all along. I didn't tell Frank immediately. He was already working himself too hard, taking on Jackson's abandoned responsibilities. When he finally saw the photos himself on a neighbor's shared post, he just nodded silently and walked out to the fields, not returning until after dark. That night, as we lay in bed, not speaking about what we both knew, I worried we were losing our son to a world that valued appearance over substance, taking over earning. I heard Frank's uneven breathing and knew he wasn't sleeping either. His hurt disguised as anger that our son seemed to be rejecting everything we had built and stood for. Junior year brought the news that knocked the wind from our sails. Jackson called on a Tuesday evening, and before I could even ask about his classes, he announced he was dropping out of college. My mind reeled, calculating the wasted tuition, the abandoned opportunity, the derailed plans. When Frank got on the extension line and heard the news, his silence spoke volumes. "It's not the end of the world, Dad," Jackson said, misreading the silence. "Tara and I have a business opportunity that can't wait. We're coming home tomorrow to discuss it with you both." They arrived in a rental car, Jackson sporting an expensive watch that glinted in the sunlight as he hugged me stiffly. Tara's designer luggage seemed wildly out of place in our mudroom, where ranch boots and work gloves normally resided. The dinner that night was excruciating. Tara criticized everything from my roast chicken. "So much healthier without the skin, don't you think?" to our handcrafted furniture. "Vintage is making a comeback, I suppose." Jackson, instead of defending our home as he once would have, nodded along as if seeing it through her eyes for the first time. After dinner, Jackson unveiled their business opportunity with the rehearsed precision of a salesman. He spread glossy mock-ups across our kitchen table, covering the scarred wood where he had once done his homework. "Luxury vacation rentals," he announced proudly. "We convert part of the ranch into high-end cabins for tourists wanting the authentic Montana experience without sacrificing comfort. Tara's father knows investors who are interested." Frank's face remained impassive as Jackson continued detailing how we would need to sell off most of the cattle, repurpose the barns, and essentially transform our working ranch into a playground for wealthy tourists. "We need about $200,000 to get started," Jackson concluded, as if that were a reasonable request, "but the return on investment will be massive." Frank's response was measured but firm. "This land is for cattle, not tourists. It's what we know, what we do, and what this ranch was built for." The argument that followed set the tone for the next 3 months. Jackson and Tara stayed in his old bedroom, but it quickly became clear they viewed the ranch as an underutilized asset rather than a home and livelihood. One afternoon, I came upon Tara in Frank's office, examining our financial documents. She quickly shuffled the papers when she saw me, claiming she was just looking for a pen, but the damage to trust was done. That evening, over another tense dinner, Jackson pressed again about his development idea. "Do you have any idea what this land is worth?" he asked incredulously. "You're sitting on a gold mine and using it to raise cows. Those cows put food on your table and clothes on your back for 18 years, Frank replied evenly. "They paid for the college education you just threw away." Jackson rolled his eyes, a gesture that would have earned him a stern lecture in earlier years. "The modernization potential here is massive. You two are just too stuck in your ways to see it." The disrespect grew more blatant with each passing day. Jackson interrupted when Frank spoke, mocked our outdated traditions, and treated the ranch like a hotel rather than contributing to its upkeep. Frank began working longer hours, leaving before dawn and returning after dinner to minimize contact with his own son. I found myself crying alone in the laundry room one afternoon, folding Jackson's designer clothes and wondering where I had gone wrong as a mother. Had we been too strict, too lenient? Had we somehow failed to instill the values we thought were being absorbed through years of example? Jackson's next demand struck at the heart of Frank's identity as a rancher. "I want to be added to the ranch deed," he announced over breakfast one morning. "If I'm going to invest my future here, I need security." Frank put down his coffee cup slowly. "Ownership of this ranch must be earned through consistent work and demonstrating you understand what it means to be responsible for land and animals. You haven't shown either lately." When Frank left for the fields, Tara cornered me in the kitchen. "You know," she said with practiced concern, "you could be helping your son succeed if you would just talk some sense into your husband. Jackson has such potential, and this place is holding him back." The manipulation was transparent, but it still stung to see how completely my son had aligned himself with this outlook. Jackson refused to help with even basic ranch chores while still expecting financial support. He slept late, complained about the Wi-Fi speed, and spent hours on his phone discussing investment opportunities that always seemed to require our money but none of our input. After 3 months of this increasingly tense cohabitation, I suggested family counseling. The idea was met with derision from Jackson. "We don't need someone poking around in our family business," he said, though he had been perfectly willing to transform our family business into a commercial venture. The breaking point came when Frank discovered that equipment had gone missing from the workshop. A careful inventory revealed that several valuable tools, including an expensive chainsaw and welding equipment, were gone. When confronted, Jackson admitted he had sold them for quick cash to explore some options. That night, Frank installed a padlock on the barn and workshop doors. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of us. Trust had been completely broken within our own family. Jackson's behavior deteriorated further. He stayed out late in town, coming home smelling of alcohol and radiating resentment. Tara constantly whispered in his ear, reinforcing his sense of entitlement to the ranch's assets, without any of the corresponding responsibility. I made countless attempts to reconnect with the son I had raised. I tried reminiscing about happy memories, asking about his genuine interests beyond money, even offering to help him develop a reasonable business plan that might honor both his ambitions and our legacy. Each attempt was rebuffed with increasing contempt. "You just don't get it." Mom became his refrain. "The world doesn't work the way you and Dad think it does anymore." But the world of consequences still worked exactly as it always had, and Jackson was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The morning that changed everything began like many others during that difficult period. I was preparing breakfast when I noticed my mother's silver serving spoons were missing from the dining room hutch. They were family heirlooms passed down through 3 generations. At first I thought I had misplaced them while cleaning, but a sinking feeling told me otherwise. While searching for them, Frank came in from checking the mail, his face ashen. In his hand was a letter from the bank questioning his signature on loan documents he had never seen. Someone had attempted to take out a $15,000 loan using ranch equipment as collateral. "Get Jackson up," Frank said quietly. The calm in his voice was more frightening than any shouting could have been. "We need to talk. Now." I found Jackson and Tara still in bed at 10:30 in the morning. When I told them Frank needed to speak with them immediately, Jackson groaned about another lecture, but the seriousness in my expression must have registered because they dressed and came downstairs without further complaint. Frank was waiting at the kitchen table, the documents, an empty space where the silver had been laid out like evidence. He motioned for them to sit down. "I have spent 45 years building this ranch," Frank began, his voice steady. "I have worked every day through blizzards, droughts, market crashes, and personal injuries. Not once did I take what wasn't mine or try to cheat my way to success." Jackson shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "These loan documents," Frank continued, pushing the papers forward, "have a forgery of my signature on them, and your mother's family silver is missing, along with other items from around the house." "Maybe you should keep better track of your things," Tara interjected with a smirk. Frank ignored her, keeping his eyes fixed on our son. "You have a choice to make today, Jackson. Either commit to honest work on this ranch following the rules of this household, or pack your things and leave immediately." Jackson's face flushed. "That's your solution. Work like a dog for minimum wage on this outdated ranch or hit the road." "This outdated ranch fed and clothed you your entire life," Frank replied. "And it's holding me back now," Jackson shot back. "If you had any vision at all, you'd see the potential here. Just give me $50,000 to launch my business elsewhere, and I'll show you what real success looks like." Frank shook his head slowly. "You haven't earned a penny of ranch money. What you've done is steal from your family and attempt fraud." "Because you've left me no choice," Jackson stood up, his voice rising. "You're so stuck in your ways that you can't see any path but your own." The argument escalated quickly, years of building tension exploding in the small kitchen. Tara added fuel with snide remarks about outdated mentality and how Jackson was wasting his potential tied to a failing industry. I tried to mediate, stepping between them as their voices grew louder. "There must be a compromise here. Jackson, we want to support your dreams, but trust has to be rebuilt first." Jackson turned on me. Then his face contorted with rage I had never seen before. "You always take his side. You pretend to understand, but you're just as bad as he is." "We've only wanted what's best for you," I said, reaching for his arm. "Everything we've done has been out of love." What happened next plays in slow motion in my memory, though it must have taken only seconds. Jackson jerked away from my touch, then swung back around, his open hand connecting hard with my cheek. The force knocked me backward against the counter. The sound of the slap seemed to echo in the sudden absolute silence. My cheek burned, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shock of having my son's hand strike my face. Frank's voice, when it came, was deadly quiet. "Get out of my house, now." Jackson stood frozen, perhaps as shocked by his action as we were. Tara was the first to move, tugging at his arm with what looked disturbingly like satisfaction in her eyes. "Fine," Jackson finally said, his voice hollow. "I'm done with this place anyway." As they packed, I sat at the kitchen table holding a cold cloth to my face. Frank moved around silently, his posture rigid with controlled fury. When Jackson came downstairs with their bags, he paused in the doorway. "This ranch will be mine someday anyway," he said, looking directly at Frank. "Half at least. I'm your son whether you like it or not." Frank didn't respond, just held the door open, his expression unreadable. We stood on the porch and watched their rental car kick up dust as it disappeared down our long driveway. Only when it was out of sight did Frank turn to me, gently removing the cloth to examine my cheek. A bruise was already forming. "I'm so sorry, Alexia," he whispered, pulling me into his arms as my tears finally came. I collapsed against his chest, sobbing for the sweet little boy who had once followed us around the ranch, eager to help and learn. Where had he gone? What stranger had taken his place? That night I stood in the doorway of Jackson's empty bedroom, touching my bruised cheek and wondering how we had arrived at this unimaginable place. The physical pain would fade quickly, but the wound to my heart felt like it might never heal. The adjustment to Jackson's absence was difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the missing person at our dinner table or the extra work that fell to us with one fewer pair of hands. It was the constant presence of his absence, if that makes any sense. The ranch was full of reminders: his saddle in the barn, his childhood artwork still magneted to the refrigerator, the height marks on the kitchen doorframe showing his growth over the years. I called his cell phone repeatedly in those first few months. The calls went straight to voicemail until eventually the number was disconnected. I sent emails that bounced back and letters that received no response. I even tried reaching out through social media before discovering he had blocked both Frank and me. Through mutual friends in town, we learned that Jackson and Tara had moved to Denver. He was working for a real estate development company, apparently giving up on his own business ventures for the time being. I took some comfort in knowing he was safe, at least, though the silence between us ached like a phantom limb. Frank handled the estrangement differently. He refused to speak Jackson's name as if our son had become a ghost we shouldn't acknowledge. But I sometimes found him in Jackson's room late at night, sitting on the bed and staring at the walls covered in rodeo ribbons and childhood photographs. I kept a small box of Jackson's baby items and favorite toys hidden in my closet. Sometimes when Frank was out working, I would take them out, touching the tiny booties and remembering the sweet baby who had once been the center of our world. The ranch continued operations under Frank's redoubled work ethic. It seemed he channeled all his hurt and disappointment into physical labor, working longer hours than a man his age should. I worried about him, but understood the therapy he found in the familiar rhythm of ranch work. When my 65th birthday came and went without any acknowledgement from Jackson, I finally accepted that the silence might be permanent. That was the first time I truly allowed myself to grieve, not just for our current estrangement, but for the future I had imagined that would never come to pass. Jackson taking over the ranch, grandchildren running through the fields, our current estrangement, family legacy, continuing through generations. The first sign that something was wrong with Frank's health came that winter. A persistent cough that he dismissed as just a cold lingered for weeks, then months. He tired more easily but refused to slow down. When he began losing weight, and I noticed blood in his handkerchief, I finally put my foot down and insisted on a doctor's visit. The diagnosis hit like a Montana blizzard, sudden and devastating stage 4 lung cancer, already spread to his lymph nodes and liver, terminal. The doctor spoke of quality time and making him comfortable rather than cure or recovery. Frank took the news with the same stoic practicality he approached everything. "No use crying over what can't be changed," he said as we drove home from the oncologist's office. "We've got arrangements to make." The very next day, he called Mr. Patterson, the lawyer who had handled our affairs for 30 years. Frank insisted on meeting immediately to update his will. Over the next few weeks, even as the chemotherapy began taking its toll, Frank had several lengthy sessions with Mr. Patterson giving very specific instructions about the ranch and our assets. Frank's physical decline was agonizing to witness. The strong, vital rancher who could work from sunup to sundown became gaunt and weak. His thick hair fell out from the treatments, and his voice, once able to carry across the pasture, became a raspy whisper. I became his full-time caregiver while simultaneously learning everything about running the ranch that I had previously left to him. Our loyal foreman Joe stepped up tremendously, taking on additional responsibilities and training me on aspects of ranch management I had never handled before. During Frank's more lucid moments between pain medications, he was determined to teach me everything he knew. "The south pasture needs rotating every 6 weeks in summer," he would say, or "Never trust Henderson at the cattle auction, he'll lowball you every time." I wrote everything down in a notebook that became my ranch management Bible. Frank's last coherent conversation happened about a week before he passed. He rallied briefly one evening, sitting up in bed and speaking more clearly than he had in days. "Alexia," he said, taking my hand in his bony, "one promise me you'll preserve what we built. Not for Jackson, but for us. For what it stands for." "I promise," I whispered, holding back tears. "The lawyer knows everything," he added, his eyes drifting closed again. "Trust Patterson." Frank died peacefully 3 days later, slipping away while I held his hand through the night. After 45 years of marriage, I was a widow at 68, solely responsible for a 500-acre ranch and an uncertain future. The community rallied around me as I made funeral arrangements. Neighbors brought food, offered help with ranch chores, and shared memories of Frank that made me laugh and cry in equal measure. He had been respected and loved beyond our family circle, something I had always known but never fully appreciated, until I saw the outpouring of support. The night before the funeral, as I sat alone in our too-quiet house, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but when I answered, the voice stopped my heart. "Mom, it's Jackson. I heard about Dad. I'll be there tomorrow." Just those few words after 5 years of silence. No questions about how I was coping. No details about the funeral he somehow knew was happening. Before I could gather my thoughts to respond, he had hung up. I barely slept that night, my mind cycling through all the possible scenarios of seeing my son again after so long. Would he be remorseful? Angry? Had he changed? Would seeing him reopen the wound of his departure, or begin a healing process? Most importantly, did I have the strength to face him while also saying goodbye to my husband? As I finally drifted off near dawn, I realized that grief had become a familiar companion in recent years, first for my estranged son, and now for my departed husband. I could only hope that the morning would bring some measure of peace, though I never could have predicted exactly how events would unfold. The morning of Frank's funeral dawned clear and crisp, the kind of autumn day he would have appreciated. I dressed carefully in a simple black dress that Frank had always said brought out the blue in my eyes. Looking in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me, her face lined with grief and her hair completely silver now. By 10 o'clock, the ranch house was filled with neighbors and friends bringing casseroles and sharing stories about Frank. Sheriff Miller, who had been Frank's fishing buddy for 20 years, spoke movingly about his contributions to the community, from organizing the annual cattle drive fundraiser for the local school to serving on the volunteer fire department. In the living room, I had set up a memorial display photographs, spanning Frank's life from young cowboy to respected rancher, his favorite saddle draped with his worn leather work gloves and his boots placed carefully beneath. It looked both poignant and incomplete, missing the presence of our only child. As 11 o'clock approached and people began making their way to the ranch's small chapel for the service, I found myself watching the driveway through the window, wondering if Jackson would actually appear as promised. The service began without him, and I felt a familiar mix of disappointment and resignation settle in my chest as I took my seat in the front row. Pastor Williams had just begun the eulogy when I heard the chapel door open. Turning along with everyone else, I saw a black luxury SUV pulling up outside, and then Jackson was standing in the doorway looking older and harder than the son who had left 5 years before. He was expensively dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than 3 months of ranch profits, his hair styled in a way that seemed calculated to look effortless. In his hand he carried a leather portfolio. What struck me most was what was missing there were no tears in his eyes, no grief in his expression. He gave me a curt nod but made no move to join me in the front row, instead standing at the back of the chapel, occasionally checking his watch. The service continued with friends sharing memories of Frank that made the congregation both laugh and cry. I spoke briefly about our life together, my voice surprisingly steady as I talked about the man who had been my partner in every sense of the word for nearly 5 decades. Throughout it all, Jackson remained detached, his expression unreadable. After the graveside service, everyone gathered back at the ranch house for a reception. The living room and kitchen were filled with people eating, drinking, and sharing stories about Frank. The atmosphere, shifting from solemnity to the kind of celebratory remembrance he would have wanted. I was speaking with Frank's oldest friend Robert when I felt a presence at my elbow. Jackson had finally approached, but not in the way I had imagined during countless sleepless nights over the years. There was no emotional reconciliation, no tearful apology, not even a hug for his newly widowed mother. Instead, he cleared his throat and said in a businesslike tone, "We need to discuss the property division." I stared at him in disbelief. "Jackson, your father's funeral reception is hardly the time or place for this discussion. We can talk tomorrow when everyone has gone." "I have meetings tomorrow," he replied impatiently. "This won't take long." People nearby had fallen silent, watching the interaction with uncomfortable expressions. Jackson either didn't notice or didn't care about the inappropriateness of his timing. He opened his leather portfolio and pulled out some documents. "As Frank's son, I'm entitled to half this ranch," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I've already spoken with a developer who's interested in purchasing my portion." The room went completely still. Joe, our foreman, moved to stand protectively beside me, along with several of our longtime ranch hands. Their presence gave me strength as I faced my son, this stranger wearing Jackson's face. "Your father had very specific wishes," I began, but Jackson cut me off. "Dad didn't understand the potential of this land," he said dismissively. "The developer I'm working with sees it clearly. We could get $15 million for this property if it's properly developed." The casual way he spoke about selling off our life's work, about erasing everything Frank had built, struck me like a physical blow. Before I could respond, the front door opened, and Mr. Patterson entered carrying his briefcase. I had asked him to come by later for the official reading of the will, but his timing couldn't have been more perfect. "I believe I might be of assistance here," Mr. Patterson said, looking from me to Jackson. "Since everyone concerned is present, perhaps this is a good time to address the matter of Frank's estate." Jackson straightened his tie and smiled confidently. "Excellent. Let's get this settled." Mr. Patterson asked for everyone's attention, then opened his briefcase and withdrew Frank's will. "I'll now read the last will and testament of Franklin James Harrington," he announced formally. What followed was a masterclass in careful legal planning. Frank had indeed thought of everything. The will began with small bequests to various friends and charitable organizations before addressing the ranch itself. "To my son Jackson, Frank Harrington, Mr. Patterson read, I leave a trust fund in the amount of $50,000 to be administered by Alexia Harrington and released in full upon the completion of one of the following conditions, either 5 consecutive years of honest, Employment unrelated to the family ranch or 1 year of full-time work on the Harrington Ranch, under the supervision of Alexia Harrington or her designated ranch manager. Jackson's face began to redden as Mr. Patterson continued. The Harrington Ranch, including all land buildings, equipment, livestock, and related assets, I leave in its entirety to my wife, Alexia Marie Harrington, to manage as she sees fit during her lifetime. Mr. Patterson paused before reading the next section. Furthermore, upon Alexia's passing, or should she choose to retire from ranch management ownership of the Harrington Ranch, shall transfer to a cooperative ownership structure between the following individuals who have shown true dedication to its legacy: Joseph Miller, foreman; Samuel Tucker, ranch hand of 20 years; Maria Lopez, livestock manager; and Thomas Wilson, equipment supervisor. The named employees looked at each other in shock as Mr. Patterson continued reading the detailed succession plan Frank had created, ensuring the ranch would continue as a working cattle operation rather than being sold or developed. Jackson's face contorted with shock, then rage, then disbelief, as he realized he had been effectively disinherited, except for the conditional trust fund. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered when Mr. Patterson finished. "I'll contest this. He wasn't in his right mind when he wrote this. You all manipulated him when he was sick." Mr. Patterson calmly produced another document. Frank anticipated such a response. "Here is a certificate from 3 separate doctors attesting to his mental competence at the time this will was drafted and signed. Additionally, our sessions were video recorded with Frank's explicit permission, should the need for evidence arise." Jackson looked around the room wildly, as if seeking allies, but found only solemn faces. "He can't do this. I'm his son. I have rights to this property." "Not according to Montana state law, and your father's legally executed," Mr. Patterson replied evenly. "There's one more thing I said quietly, finding strength I didn't know I possessed. Frank left a letter to be read to you publicly if you contested the will." Mr. Patterson nodded and withdrew a sealed envelope from his briefcase. Frank was quite specific about this. He opened the envelope and began reading Frank's words. "Jackson, if this letter is being read, it means you've shown up looking for an inheritance rather than to mourn your father. The last time I saw you, you struck your mother and threatened to take half the ranch that you refused to work for. A man reaps what he sows in this life. You sowed disrespect, dishonesty, and entitlement. This is your harvest." The letter continued, Frank's voice, seeming to fill the room through Mr. Patterson's reading. "Real legacy isn't about money or property. It's about the values you live by and the good you do with your time on this earth. The people named in my will have shown the integrity, work ethic, and care for the land that you rejected. They've earned what you demanded." The final lines were the most powerful. "Should you ever find your way back to the values your mother and I tried to instill, there will be a place for you here, not as an owner, but as a man willing to work and learn with humility. The choice, as always, is yours." When Mr. Patterson finished reading, the room was completely silent. Jackson stood frozen for a moment, his face unreadable, before shoving his papers back into his portfolio. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," he snapped, then stormed out, slamming the door so hard that one of Frank's framed photographs fell from the wall. As the sound of his SUV speeding away faded, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief wash over me. I hadn't raised my voice or lost my composure. I hadn't needed to. Frank's careful planning had spoken for both of us. Joe approached and put a weathered hand on my shoulder. "We won't let you or Frank down, Mrs. Harrington," he said simply, the other named employees, nodding in agreement behind him. As the reception continued, I felt Frank's presence more strongly than ever, and for the first time since his diagnosis, I felt certain that everything would somehow be all right. The day after the funeral, the enormity of my new reality hit me full force. The house felt cavernous without Frank's presence, without his heavy boots by the door or the sound of his coffee cup hitting the kitchen table each morning. I wandered from room to room, touching his things, still half expecting him to walk through the door and ask about the day's work on the ranch. I was a widow at 68, responsible for 500 acres and dozens of employees, having lost both my husband to death and my son to estrangement. The weight of this dual loss felt almost unbearable, as I sat alone in our bedroom, surrounded by Frank's clothes that still held his scent. What I couldn't have predicted was the visitor who arrived at the ranch exactly 1 week after the funeral. I was reviewing cattle vaccination records with Joe when a car I didn't recognize pulled up. To my absolute shock, Tara stepped out looking older and less polished than the last time I had seen her. "Mrs. Harrington," she said hesitantly when I met her on the porch. "I hope it's okay that I came. I heard about Frank and I wanted to talk to you." I invited her in with more grace than I felt curious about what could possibly have brought her back to the ranch after all this time. As we sat in the living room with untouched cups of tea between us, she revealed something I never expected. "Jackson and I have been divorced for 2 years," she said, looking down at her ringless hands. "I wanted you to know that I've had a lot of time to think about the role I played in what happened between Jackson and your family." She went on to explain how her own upbringing in a wealthy but emotionally cold family had warped her values, how she had encouraged Jackson's sense of entitlement because it mirrored her own. "I pushed him to demand more from you," and Frank, she admitted. "I genuinely thought he deserved it just for being your son. I didn't understand then what it means to earn something." Her candor was surprising, as was the information she shared about Jackson's life since leaving the ranch. His business ventures had largely failed, one after another. The development company he worked for had laid him off during cutbacks. He had struggled with drinking for a while after their divorce. "He's not a bad person," she said, and I could hear the remnants of affection in her voice. "He just lost his way." "We both did. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry for my part in it." After she left, I sat on the porch swing for a long time processing this new information. Jackson was struggling. Part of me felt a vindictive satisfaction that the easy path he had expected hadn't materialized, but a larger part just felt sad for the lost years and opportunities. The next months passed in a blur of activity as I took over ranch operations fully. Joe was my right-hand patient as I learned systems and procedures Frank had handled for decades. At 68, I was mastering new skills. Most people never attempt at any age: negotiating cattle prices at auction, understanding equipment, maintenance schedules, reviewing employment contracts. I discovered a strength within myself I never knew existed. The same woman who had once deferred to her husband on all major ranch decisions was now confidently directing our seasonal operations, making investment choices, and even expanding our breeding program with a new line of organic grass-fed beef. The rhythms of ranch life became my anchor. The predictable cycles of calving season, summer grazing, fall roundup, and winter feeding gave structure to days that might otherwise have been swallowed by grief. I found unexpected joy in watching new calves take their first wobbly steps in the changing colors of our pastures, through the seasons, in the satisfaction of work well done. 3 months after the funeral, a letter arrived postmarked from Seattle. I recognized Jackson's handwriting immediately, though it seemed less confident, somehow the letters less precisely formed than I remembered. Inside was a brief note, just half a page, but it contained something I had waited 5 years to hear: an apology. Not elaborate or poetic, but seemingly genuine in its simplicity. "Mom," he wrote, "I've hit rock bottom since Dad died, and the will reading. Lost my job apartment and most of my so-called friends. Had a lot of time to think about who I've become. I'm sorry for hitting you that day. Sorry for everything, really. I don't expect forgiveness or money. Just wanted you to know." He didn't ask for anything, which was perhaps the most significant change of all. No requests for another chance. No hints about reconsidering the will. No manipulative appeals to maternal obligation. Just an acknowledgement of wrongdoing and regret. I waited a week before responding carefully, considering each word. I didn't want to push him away with recriminations, but I also couldn't pretend the hurt hadn't happened. My letter was kind but clear. The door was open to communication, but trust would need to be rebuilt slowly, and the terms of Frank's will would remain unchanged. A month later, Jackson called. The conversation was awkward, with long pauses and careful word choices on both sides, but it was civil. He had found work as a ranch hand on a small operation outside Seattle, ironically returning to the skills he had once rejected. When I asked why, he gave an answer that suggested genuine reflection. "It's what I know," he said, simply. "And it turns out I'm actually good at it. Better than I was at trying to be something I'm not." We agreed to meet in 6 months' time at a restaurant halfway between our homes' neutral ground where we could begin the long process of getting to know each other again as the people we had become. In the months that followed, I often thought about the nature of motherhood and family. My love for Jackson had never died even when he was at his worst. It had been wounded, certainly buried under layers of hurt and disappointment, but it remained waiting for the possibility of reconciliation. I came to understand the wisdom in Frank's approach to the will. He hadn't disinherited Jackson out of vengeance, but had instead created a path for him to earn his way back through honest work and changed behavior. It was the difference between enabling and supporting a distinction I had sometimes struggled to make as a mother eager to see her child happy. The ranch continued to thrive under the cooperative management structure Frank had envisioned. Joe and the other named employees brought fresh ideas while respecting traditions, finding a balance that I think would have made Frank proud. We expanded our sustainable practices, installed solar panels on the barn roofs, and even started a small educational program for local school children to learn about responsible ranching. Whether Jackson would someday be part of this future remained an open question. The conditional trust Frank had established was still there waiting for Jackson to fulfill either requirement. The choice was his, as it had always been. What I know now, looking back on this journey, is that family ties can be damaged, but not always destroyed. They stretch, they fray, they sometimes seem ready to snap completely, but there often remains a thread of connection that can be strengthened again with time and sincere effort from both sides. I never expected to be starting over at 68, running a ranch alone, and cautiously rebuilding a relationship with my estranged son. Life rarely gives us the story we thought we were writing. But I found unexpected strength in this new chapter. Neither what I feared nor what I had hoped for, but something with its own value and meaning. Has someone in your life ever disappointed you deeply, but later showed signs of genuine change? Do you think there are some actions that can never be forgiven, or is reconciliation always possible with true remorse? I'd love to hear your pressed thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of family forgiveness and finding strength in unexpected places. Thank you for listening to my journey, and may you find the wisdom to know when to hold on and when to let go in your own relationships.